He is at the moment a professor at Berlin Technical University and has been teaching in London for a number of years, many different universities like the Bartlett recently, Westminster University, also at the South Bank University where I was his student in 1987. So okay, let's welcome Kevin Rhowbotham.
Hi. 20 years of schooling and they put me on the day shift. It feels a little like that after sort of 10 years of teaching, really. 10 years of teaching which I entered into in order to, certainly naively from my original perspective, make some kind of political engagement. And I have to admit to myself that this is a fundamental failure, that the political success that I wanted to claim through the kinds of work that I did with my students didn't materialize. The success of it is, of course, that something can be salvaged from this ambition, and that is that a political architecture might be possible at all. Because the question of a political architecture is once again on the lips of the proto-avant-garde, not on the lips of the official avant-garde, for good reason, which I'll try to illustrate in a second. But certainly it is around and has become once again possible to think. As I was telling Patrick just a second ago, I wrote this manifesto, which is one of many manifestos I wrote, manifesto of barbitecture, manifesto of non-specific urbanism, and many other things, all extremely eloquent and very tongue-in-cheek. It was a kind of engagement with architecture which is very British, the sort of thing that Dave Green and Andrew Holmes are currently engaged in. For those of you who are looking at the work of Casa Verde, probably the most interesting work that's being done of that kind at the moment, but nevertheless a very closely drawn kind of work, closely drawn up. I mean, I guess the big problem for me, certainly the big problem with respect to the way one might now proceed given this precipitant failure of 10 years of teaching, is a question which centers around this. Is architecture, or can architecture be social? Can it be social? Can we engage with the kind of architectural production which can re-establish a link with issues of the social? In order to ascertain whether this is possible, of course, one has to fall back on an analysis of the contemporary position. And the contemporary position, from my point of view, is one which has embraced some of the less some of the more contentious aspects of post-structuralism, principally issues that have emerged from philosophers like Derrida and social critics like Baudrillard. The things that have settled most significantly with respect to the possibilities of the avant-garde are those which, from my point of view, are exceptionally narcissistic. The me decade, the 80s decade, is a decade in which the collapse of philosophy into a kind of circular rhetorical figure beneath the authorship of someone like Jacques Derrida was a perfect foil against which a narcissistic architecture could structure itself. Not only that, it could claim for itself an extrinsic qualification, that is, an extrinsic authority, without therefore having to rely upon itself to produce the theoretical means by which the key issues of human culture could be addressed. In other words, what we have is a kind of, in those immortal words of course I've forgotten his name, of Art and Language, narcissistic formalism was an opportunity, or neurotic formalism rather, was an opportunity for what I come to describe and increasingly describe as a loss of teleology to establish itself within the general context of architectural production. It's this loss of teleology now which I think we have to address. In other words, And what I mean by a loss of teleology, of course, for those of you who don't know the term, and it's a fairly esoteric term, is that there has been a loss of an end cause, a loss of a target against which the direction of the avant-garde might be directed. In other words, a loss of a social target or a social value which might set into play a series of requirements which the avant-garde could address. At the moment, being extrinsically qualified by a reference to an artificially privileged discipline, philosophy, architecture can, of course, construct for itself a variety of narcissistic topographies and iconographic representations, and therefore engage absolutely in the economy of what has come to be called post-Fordism. In other words, in a late capitalist economy, as items for exchange and as personalities for exchange. I think from the Baudrillardian perspective, a perspective which of course represents the representational in a kind of circular maelstrom of simulation, or indeed from the Nietzschean perspective which underlies it, which argues that reality, of course, has no ground at all, no ontological ground at all, which is secure, but relies on the kind of interplay of surfaces, is a perfect kind of opportunity for the establishment of a highly iconographic, narcissistic, and formally neurotic avant-garde, which is really interested in establishing itself within an economy structured by its references to commodity fetishism. But for me, and I frankly feel a very lonely person, certainly from this perspective, because once one begins to make this kind of analysis, one has to swallow very hard on the fact that one was always and also involved in this kind of overcoding. That the work, certainly the work that a lot of my students did, was directed first of all with respect to the way it wanted to, in a tribalistic kind of way, associate itself with a visual styling, rather than to comprehensively engage with issues of concept and try and follow those conceptual positions through to a different kind of architecture which then might mark the social. But the teaching was problematical, certainly from my point of view, because it contained a far too overriding post-structuralist reading, which I'll try and explain in a second. So my own problems, I suppose, can be summed up really by a quote from Robin Evans in his book, The Projective Cast. That is with respect to the current avant-garde, and that is this. A designed environment of apparent chaos has to be predicated on a precise technical control of the object. The greater the control, the greater the phantasm of release produced by it. An old formula for cathartic art still applies. Now, it is this internal contradiction that has gnawed away, certainly, at my continuing faith in what initially I was prepared to see as a liberating thrust from the deconstructive avant-garde. Because, of course, I was prepared to purchase, and I use the word advisedly, the central thesis of this kind of engagement, which is, and I'll just read it to you as I've written it down, something like this. What hides behind this argument, that is an argument to liberating formalism, what hides behind this argument is the notion that a formal investigation of the possibilities of architectural representation can be liberating in itself. And this is, I think, something we must really guard against. That the kind of architectures proposed by a neurotic formalist avant-garde in the guise of a deconstructivist thrust has at its center this notion that if one makes something different enough, then simply because it's juxtaposed to those things that go before it in the context of cultural production, this is sufficient to produce a liberalizing moment. In other words, when one was within a building by these, this particular group of architects, one is liberalized by this experience. The only problem remains, of course, that even though this is a liberalizing and one would assume emancipating experience, there remains, of course, a huge problem about those people who are simply not emancipated by this kind of architecture, that the general conditions of everyday life for the majority under late capitalism remain miserable, and that the architectural avant-garde from this perspective has nothing to say about it. In other words, one immediately begins to understand that this aesthetic, which predicates itself on its specificity as the basis of a liberalizing moment, is itself the last moment of its closure. It is the point at which it disappears, in effect. What I'm trying to say is, neurotic formalism in this guise, in the guise of deconstruction, offering itself as a liberalizing moment in form, of course, produces an aesthetic which is so specialized that no general project for the emancipation of the majority can be drawn out of it. None at all. Because its operating politics are, of course, the politics of commodity fetishism. So that's my problem, really. And it is an acute problem, certainly for myself, as I took teaching as a very serious kind of engagement with the possibilities of production, even though it contains within it tremendous contradictions. Most thorny of all, I suppose, is the contradiction that teaching itself produces nothing, or is in the service of a kind of production which is more legitimate and prior to the action of teaching, which robs it, of course, of a theory of itself, a material theory of its own production, since it doesn't even recognize itself as legitimate production. And from this position, one has to say that a new kind of engagement from the point of view teaching must be erected in order, certainly from a personal point of view, to reassess, to re-examine the possibilities of making a kind of teaching production which could open up these social perspectives and move away from the closures of the current obsessions of the deconstructive avant-garde. So where to go from here? I mean, and after so long, I was educated at Cornell. My professors were Colin Rowe and Matthias Ungers, but I spent most of my time in the anthropology department with James Boone and Robert Asher. James Boone was the leading expert on Levi-Strauss in the United States at the time. I was part of a group from the anthropology department who were involved in a series of seminars given by Derrida, who was at the time in the United States, having been invited to Princeton by Paul de Man. The anthropology department was at a point at which it was preparing its post-structuralist critique of the discipline of anthropology. So my background is fairly secure with respect to structuralism and post-structuralism. But I've come, as a consequence of this fundamental disappointment, to try and realign myself with those people who I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. Those people are now speaking about a politics of architecture, and a renewed politics of architecture, and a movement away from this kind of narcissistic formalism that is dominating the avant-garde, a move to a kind of material theory of architecture. Now, what I've got to show you is a reassessment of work that was done 10 years ago. And this is by no means by way of an apology. I take the work that has been done and I'm trying to reassess it, trying to criticize it effectively from my point of view and offer that criticism to you. So I'm not showing you this work as work which should be in any way instructive for you. That is, it's not work that one might now appropriate and move with, but something that one might move beyond. There are lessons that I think I try to learn from it, and those are the lessons I want to share with you. So, a material theory of architecture, is this possible, and where might it start from? Necessarily, I have a peculiar, thanks, I have a peculiar interpretation of this notion of a material critique. It proceeds, of course, from a weight of post-structuralist theory, which had led me in the first instance, from the point of view of teaching, to try and reassess what was the really real subject, effectively now the material subject of architectural speculation. And this has always been a profound problem. Certainly, it's caused a lot of problems for me, for a number of reasons. I have an unfortunate kind of rather excitable personality, and I'm blessed with a particularly blessed, I suppose is the wrong word, but with a kind of doggedly inquiring intellect. So these two things put together doesn't make often great, very convivial juries. Many times I've been in bitter conversations, bitter arguments about things that seem to me to be completely obvious, like, for instance, architects do not build anything. I mean, of course, this comes as a kind of an amazing kind of revelation to many of you, because, of course, colloquial discourse constantly refers, or allows you to refer, to this authority of of the architect as the agent of building. This is complete nonsense, as you will find if any of you have attempted to build anything. You try and build, if you try a material engagement with the reality of a brick column, a square brick column, you will find, of course, that you cannot build it straight. No, of course you can't build it straight, because of course it takes 3 to 5 years to learn how to do this. Just as if you want to make a mild steel window and you attempt to weld together two elements, you will find, of course, that the two elements will swell. It's called weld swelling. Weld swelling is something you learn to control. You learn it. It's a knowledge which architects don't have. It's a knowledge which they constantly claim for themselves to have, of course, by acts of appropriation in the classical hierarchical relationship between white and blue-collar effort, white and blue-collar labour. But they do so, and they do so by... and the result is, of course, a tremendous obscuring of the possibilities of speculation. Now, this is the conclusion that I draw. Once we turn away, once we turn our faces into myth, and this notion that architects build is, from my point of view, entirely mythical, once one turns one face to myth, one then misses the opportunity of a material analysis of the real conditions of architectural production. One has to ask, what do architects produce? From a real point of view, what do they really produce? And of course, what they really produce is drawings. This is what they produce. This is what they're expert at. This is what they're capable of. And this emerges from a post-structuralist question from my point of view, which is, of course, one can dress it up in other terms. I mean, in a sense, there is not too much space between asking what is the materiality of architectural production and asking what do architects do from a post-structuralist perspective. But one can ask, for instance, what is the discourse of architecture, which would have a similar, which would have a post-structuralist affect, which is, of course, what I did. What is the discourse of architecture? The discourse of architecture is constructed from these means, these drawing means. This is the language, this is the syntax, this is the grammar, this is the means by which architects are prepared to think. Now, I crossed this, of course, with my interest in Giambattista Vico, who I'm not going to go into at length, but Vico, interestingly, left me simply with an aphorism that I keep always in my head, which is when one brings when something enters the world, something else is obscured. So when you bring something into the world, for instance, when you invent something, when attention is drawn to this something, something else becomes obscured by this act. So too with this kind of myth of architecture as building, but so too in terms of the drawing. And what I wanted to know was, were there, of course, any kind of codes of drawing, ways of drawing, controlling structures of drawing, which might obscure those things which might constitute an alternative? Could I, for instance, expand the possibilities of drawing, and with it, the possibilities of architecture? And was there a dependency between these two? Which, of course, I, in a sense, although contrived this question. I'd already decided that there was before I asked the question, actually. So what this does, or what it did for me, and what I can reinterpret now as, is to establish the possibilities of a material theory of architectural production, which is established precisely at the surface of the drawing. That is, it is the drawing, the means by which one can draw, the dimensions of drawing, which constitute the possibility of architecture. I guess I've made that point. And so, where to start? And of course, there are many many places to start this material engagement, this deeper kind of exhumation of this volume of the drawing. I remember I wrote an article once called The Graphical Meridian, in which I tried to lyrically challenge the banal and closing understanding of the nature of architectural space, or the space of architectural production, by characterizing the drawing, which I see from my point of view as a kind of infinite space in flat space. It is flat but nevertheless infinite. I mean, what I mean by that is, when you sit on the edge of your drawing, you are kind of unbalanced and feel as if you're falling into a pool. And before you do, you draw on it a dot, which is Alpha Centauri. And Alpha Centauri, of course, is, I think it's 4.9 light years from Earth. And you're suddenly stunned, stop yourself from falling, by this fact of space. Because in this pool, you've cut a breathtaking volume. Do you understand what I mean? By making a dot and calling it Alpha Centauri, you engage in the terms, the syntactical and grammatical terms of a drawing, of making drawing, and making concepts with respect to that drawing. So the space between you and it is suddenly opened up to 4.2 light years, which is an extremely... It's like this little aphorism. It goes like this, something like this. The philosopher comes along the road and meets a poor peasant who's complaining to him. He said, "Oh, I can't see God. You know, I've got a mundane kind of experience of life. I want to be like you, philosopher. I can't see God. I want to look further. I want to look further." And he says, "Well, look at this star over here." You know, he says, "Look at the sun. Actually, look at the sun over here." He said, "Do you see it?" He said, "Yes, I see it." He said, "Well, how much further do you want to see?" And this is the kind of thing that is central to attempting to reconceive the possibility of drawing within its mundane structure. I was bothered also, of course, by a phrase in Lefebvre, in which I mentioned yesterday, actually, in which he talks about remarks on the point or the nature of contemporary metrical drawing in architecture, which conceives of itself as utterly transparent. You know, it's a kind of metrical, mechanical drawing which places objects within a banal space, which isn't given any other dimension other than one of which attempts to associate elements and measure their distances. And says at this point in which things are apparently absolutely transparent, that is, they give clearly the information they're supposed to you, they become, of course, absolutely obscure because they hide from you the operating terms which have brought them into being. Well, this is what I wanted to really reveal. And I started a long time ago with a kind of analysis of the two-dimensionality of things, because I thought that I had to take a fairly brave move and move away from this paralyzing mythology about the three-dimensionality of architecture. I mean, those of you, I suppose all of us here are pretty sort of experienced crit sitters. We've been on many crits. I wonder how many of you have been confused by this phenomenon that one sits in front of a project and listens to the discussion of the jury, which constantly refers to the project as if it is real. and exists somewhere removed from the drawing, and that the perspectives are like pictures, like windows in fact, through which one can see solidly somewhere in the real world this object. Now, this is a kind of insanity, one my son of 17 months couldn't make. He would not mistake a drawing for a drawing, a drawing for a building. These are entirely different material affects of the world. They are entirely different. The problem is, and of course this is the source of many arguments that I've had many times on crits, that when one raises the spectre of the myth of reference with respect to drawing codes, one is thrown out of court. Now, what happens is a kind of immediate reversal. When you raise this issue, you become the child, as if it's absolutely self-evident that one should lie to oneself in order to be part of reality. Well, let's stop lying. Let's constitute a material, you see it gets harder, material critique of architecture by simply talking about the really real on the wall. I tell you something else that really bothered me as a teacher. And certainly I've done hundreds, I mean literally 36 or 37 shows, most of them in London. And many, many times I would have architects come up to me saying, why don't you do anything real? And they would be in the middle of an event in which spatially things were happening, things were there, and they would ask me, well, where is the real architecture? And I found this utterly confusing. It's part of the same thing. So, why have I told you this story? Because I want to illustrate that the first move is to recognize that the production of architectural space with respect to the possibilities of reflection, architectural reflection, for you as an architect is fundamentally two-dimensional. And it's to the two-dimensional that we have to return if we want to engage this problem materially. Okay. And of course this becomes the kind of center of my talk anyway, because I want to make a division between field and object. But first I want to explain what it is. Here are two images, one from Malevich, the one on the left, and the second from Bart van der Lek. They are neoplastic painters. One suprematist, the other more truly neoplastic, but nevertheless they're grouped in this general category. I don't want to talk about their careers and I don't want to talk about their achievements. What I just want to point out is a phenomenon about the organization of objects in this two-dimensional space and what they're trying to represent. On the left, the yellow object is distinct and presents itself as such by being contrasted to that which it isn't, to the thing which it isn't. It has figure by sitting against the thing that it isn't. We have objects and we have something else. I mean, I suppose it's much easier to see it in the second example, where the display of objects are more fragmented and smaller and don't challenge the overall ground condition of the painting. But one can conclude from this kind of analysis that there may be two values here, one called the object and one called the field, or the ground, sorry. Now this is very interesting, and it leads one to begin to ask, well, maybe, well it leads me to ask anyway, which of these two values, or maybe both of the values, but which of these two values could characterize the way that architecture has proceeded to examine this two-dimensionality of the drawing? And if there is one pole that's privileged rather than the other, what happens if we now set up an analysis of the second pole? So all I want to really state by looking at these is that we have two kinds of values. Figure, the figure or object, which sits within this ground or field, and the field itself, the field which gives the object its identity. Now, of course, the suprematist project is a fascinating project. Its reappropriation by aspects of deconstruction leaves me with a great number of problems. Its central project, of course, was one in which politically it wanted to divest itself of the obsessions of an academic art. And in order to do this, I'm not showing the Piero, by the way, as an example of what it moved against, because it moved against 19th century academic art. I show the Piero because it is a paradigm or an icon of perspectivalism, and is used many, many times to illustrate this phenomenon, the rise of perspectivalism in the Renaissance. And that suprematism saw its formal take, its formal opposition to be that which opposed academic painting on the grounds that it was non-perspectival. Now, this is a fascinating issue because it delivers us to a kind of different spatiality entirely. And one has to remember that many of the neoplasticists were theosophists and had a metaphysical understanding of the relationship between Earth and the universe, of which I'm no expert. Suffice it to say that the spatiality in which they displaced their objects, out of which they constituted compositional laws, was a spatiality which did not subtend identity metrically. That is, you couldn't identify things by assuming their measured distances as you could in perspectival space. This is a very different space, and a space which might be, one could, I suppose, contrast with perspectival space as one can contrast mathematically mundane geometry with universal geometry. They operate on different levels, but again, I'm no expert on this. Nevertheless, the space which surrounds these objects has a kind of quality which is not within the Piero example. It's a different thing entirely, which I will argue is characterized by the conditions of the field. But field, of course, is itself already an established notion in other kinds of intellectual pursuits, principally in physics. I show you this only to poke at a kind of different interpretation of disposition of objects, and try and poke at this notion of identity. At the moment, we can constitute an architecture of objects by assuming that their unrelenting surfaces are the outer expression or the limit condition of an objectness, which is absolutely distinct and different from that which lies outside it. The ether, if you like, air, if you like. This table here and this object here are distinct. They have different qualities, they can be drawn, they have existential position, they have identity. But with Einstein, of course, this becomes problematical simply because what is at the center of his theorizing is a kind of continuation of things, a kind of sameness of matter, in which one can understand the world not as an architectural drawing in which discrete objects are set one against another in a nothingness, in an ether, but as a kind of weather map in which all things are, of course, constituted in the same way, but are present as areas of low and high density. Even though the world looks different, you know, one can constitute it like this from the point of view of understanding matter as related in a field. So, the distinction and identity, the apparent identity of individual objects comes as a kind of mistake from misunderstanding the field nature and the differentiation of the field nature of the arrangement of matter. Now, it doesn't matter whether you get this idea or not. The point I'm trying to make here is that there may be a different way of understanding the arrangement of objects, and if there is one different way, then there may be many more, and that the hegemony of a single view about the way one might construct representations of the possibility of speculative architectural production could be extended. And this is not, it is neither the position of the bourgeois avant-garde nor the position of the architectural profession in general. So what I want to say about the field, well, what I want to say here is that there is a second term, really, in the Malevich. You can see the Malevich, I'm slightly overexposed this. I had great difficulties taking photographs of the computer, but the Malevich is represented up here in the top left-hand corner. That if one begins to think about this, I think about the way in which it is portraying space, then one immediately gets into sort of grave difficulties when one thinks of it with respect to the perspectival frame. Simply because these elements, displaced like this against the white field of the drawing, are of course positionless. One doesn't know where they are. They're in a continuous universal space, rather like this isometric of the displacement of the objects, and this second projection. This is a possible projection, one of many possible projections, but can't be fixed with respect to the perspective frame. So the positional conditions of the object are set in this continuous field of space. And one has to say, therefore, that one might begin to think that these paintings, this whole approach, this suprematist approach and other neoplastic approaches, is articulated more by the field than by the displacement of the objects. And therefore, one becomes highly suspicious of an avant-garde which, of course, has appropriated the aesthetics and compositional tactics of suprematism, whilst attempting with every effort to hide this in order, of course, to sort of ape the heroic tendencies of the bourgeois modernist project. They have appropriated, of course, only half of the story. The story about fragmentation, the story about the relativity of field and object and so on, but not this kind of notion of the continuous quality of field that sets these things into an indeterminate spatiality. Still, the avant-garde is fixed in the perspective frame. I mean, and I make the argument also with respect to Mondrian. I mean, and interestingly enough, this emerges at the point in which he argues very strongly to drop frames from the work. He doesn't want his work framed, and the reason he gives is that the lines that strike through the painting are lines which are continuous and go all the way around the world. So they start at this point, they go all the way around the globe, and they come back here. Now, this is a kind of objectness which is completely different from the one that one might assume Mies van der Rohe could appropriate for his brick house projects. This is not it is not a spatiality or an object spatiality which might now subtend a picturesque reading. This is nonsensical. You know, what we see here is, in a sense, a kind of dense frame of linearities, a field of linearities of which this picture captures one fragment, as does the other one over here. And this is a field quality. This is a kind of field quality out of which, look, it's like this. Try and imagine that what you see, what is here on the Mondrian is a kind of sensitive white plate which has been pressed against these linearities which exist in the ether. And it's then brought down, and an impression of these linearities is left upon it. This is what he means. This is not a displacement of objects, but an engagement with the field condition. Okay, so, field. What of the contemporary position, at least, what of other positions, or more contemporary positions, which might now appeal to this issue of field? Has there been any other people, any other interest in this in the history of urbanism, the history of architectural theory? Well, of course there has. And I suppose the most prominent, certainly the most important for me, would be the contribution of Guy Debord and Constance, the two members of the Situationist International and their take on a possible conceptual architecture which attempts a non-figural reversal of the way that one might understand the possibilities of naming an architecture at all. The Deborian Naked City project is fascinating in this regard. Superficially, it shows a kind of rerun of a Dadaist project. I think it was the Zurich Dada group that one day decided that they would have a kind of psycho-geographical rethink of the city of Zurich by hopping on and off a series of trams and therefore sort of in a collagist fashion juxtaposing different kinds of experiences across the city, thereby criticizing the continuous spatiality, the cartographical spatiality given by certain kinds of graphical organizations of the city, like the map. And here's a good example of what I was talking about earlier. When you receive the map, this of course is a means by which your creative opportunity to remember the topography of the city becomes overcoded by certain kinds of institutional interests. The map is not an innocent object. It organizes space and value with respect to its own interest. In other words, it isn't sort of somehow a demonstration of the absolute ground of reality. This is not the way things are. Of course, how could it be? Because if it was the way things are, if it was identical to reality, then it would be reality itself, and clearly it is not. Reality itself is merely a drawing. And in the drawing we have a partiality, and in that partiality a persuasion that certain values are worth more than others. So be careful. This is precisely the condition of the architectural drawing. It proselytizes certain values over others. However, the interesting thing about the Deborian drawing, about the Naked City project, and about the theory that associates itself with this project is that there may, of course, be a conceptual shift against the physical mass of the city, insofar as a notion of reclamation of the meaning of the object might take place as a conceptual engagement with the object. Now, what I mean by this is that from De Boer's point of view, one could go into the city and simply appropriate by an act of mental effort the conditions of architecture that surrounded one. In other words, and what follows from this is, of course, the occupation of empty buildings by people who can see them as somehow brought back into the life of the city. This is fascinating from my point of view, of course, because this is effectively the Deleuzian re-territorialization of space. One can re-territorialize the possibilities of a spatiality, which are fixed by the instrumental institutional interest of the city, by an act of conceptual effort. In other words, one can think a building differently. Now, this is hugely dangerous for the architectural profession, and no wonder the SI were absolutely outlawed. Because if one can rethink the potential value of the city by an act of mental effort, one doesn't have to labour. In other words, one could conceive of a city in steady state, that the city might begin to demolish itself, it might begin to disintegrate, but then might be patched up. But it would not be retransformed into the icons which are recognized to signify the powerful institutions of the state and how they keep pace with the interests of the state. In other words, that buildings might somehow take another direction, and even their programs might be transformed by an act of intellectual reflection. They may become other kinds of buildings simply by the wish of those who are occupying them becoming different from those wishes that are, in a sense, thrown over the conditions of inhabitation by things like the naming of space. So here we have a second trajectory, which we might call a conceptual field, which sets out a second alternative condition to the object on a social plane by engaging with issues of event. This is an event architecture. An architecture which sees... Well, it's kind of like this. It's the old aphorism, I don't know where it comes from, but when you could be asked, of course, this question, what is the sound of one hand clapping, without, of course, having it's impossible to give an answer to it. But in a sense, this is the kind of condition that architecture labours under all the time. It speculates on its object only from one pole of a more complex condition. What I mean by this is that the nature of architecture, of course, can't be manifested in any real sense when it isn't occupied. One can't hear the earth when there is no one to hear it. This whole problem. What does the earth sound like when nobody is on it? It is, of course, a kind of play within language, because hearing is a material affect of the human condition. If there are no humans, no one can hear it. It's like architecture in the sense that if nobody occupies the building, if there are no conditions of event within buildings, then buildings, of course, can only be half real. If no one experiences the building is only half there, one could argue. So what? Except that it may suggest that there is a second term which is related to field and which is now securely positionable within the social, and to do not with the organisation of surfaces and objects at all, but with an engagement with the nature of social interaction and social exchange, things we might call event. So it's in the SI that we see, certainly from my point of view, we see the first signs of an engagement with the notion of field, and certainly on the social level. And of course it's very positive from the point of view of my thesis, because it makes a profound political point, which I'll come to later. But one has to be very careful here, I think, because just at the moment of its creation, when it seemed as if the hegemony of the CIAM zoning policies of the city were absolute, the SI emerged with a powerful critique, only at the same time to be devalued by the emergence of the European avant-garde in a new form. And one could argue at the very point at which capitalism was now changing and transforming itself. I show the Hollein project really to show you one simple thing, that here, as opposed to the Constance and Deborian projects, we have a project about object. This is the quintessential iconographic object, a sort of sleight of hand from the great pop star Hans Hollein, who places, of course, with no effort whatsoever and with profound conceptual adroitness, a United States war aircraft carrier in the middle of the rolling countryside. Now, this is the moment from which the SI political initiative to extend the possibilities of architectural speculation beyond the object, founders. And it really founders not with Hollein, but with Cook and the archigram movement. The archigram movement, of course, were appropriators of the SI right down to the last dot. They copied their graphical tactics, they copied their graphical organisation, they copied their ideas, and of course they watered them all down and turned them into their opposite. And it's a feature of this kind of avant-gardist appropriation, which one can see many times in the history of the 20th century. However, there were, in the form of Super Studio, certainly, and another group, Archizoom, who were Italian, Super Studio being American, tendencies which, of course, have founded in their own time to establish this alternative tack. Even though that both Super Studio and Archizoom were preparing projects which were later termed dystopian. They were trying to engage an extension of space, which they saw as the terminal trajectory of an aggressive capitalism. But it began to engage this notion of field. Second thrust, beyond the SI, was the emergence of what came to be known as contextualism and neo-rationalism. As I said, I was a student of Colin Rowe and Matthias Ungers at Cornell University, so was in the middle of this kind of maelstrom, or representation of certain values of the CIAM thrust, really, in different forms. I don't want to go into that, but what I do want to talk about is the approaching moment of the field within the work of Colin Rowe. Here you see his famous opposition, and this is very amusing in the sense that I think its success relies on its sort of McLuhan-esque Videodrome quality, because here is the fundamental sort of soundbite in pictures, which, I mean, when you read through, of course, you can realize it reduces the complexity of the actual material phenomenon to something which can be received by the viewer very quickly. What he's talking about, in order to polemicize the new view of the possibility of the city, is things he calls figural object and figural space. He sees these two things as paradigms of these two architectures. He says that modernism is obsessed with the figural object, whereas he privileges the Renaissance, but a pre-modernist city might be determined which has exactly the opposite notion. That is, it doesn't privilege the object, but privileges space, or public space. And in order to show this, he makes this little collage of images in which the Unité d'habitation by Corbusier in Marseille is shown to be the cast of the Uffizi in Florence. In other words, one can fit the Unité d'habitation inside the cortile of the Uffizi. Well, rabbit out of a hat. Here we have it. You know, from figural modernism to non-figural, well, contextualism. The problem is, of course, this looks encouraging at first sight because it swapped a collagist kind of collection of figurated objects standing alone, fragmented, cast into undifferentiated field, which is not theorized by architects, either as a two-dimensional phenomenon in terms of drawing or as a social condition in terms of event. He characterizes this in a way which seems to move towards notions of field. The city is seen as a solid mass, a solid continuous mass, out of which public space can be cut. Let me just... Here, the sort of paradigmatic illustration which goes with this sheet from Collage City, which is, of course, the Plan Voisin by Corbusier in the middle of Paris, cut against the Nolly Plan of Rome. Now, here, public space is shown as white, and building is shown, non-accessible building is shown in black. So you have this kind of opposition between enterable and non-enterable space, which is then shown against this collection of isolated objects in order to illustrate its position. But here we have the possibility of a field condition. In other words, that the city is a continuous thing out of which things are cut. Oh. Oh, shit. I mean, and a very an interesting illustration was always given, certainly by Ungers, of this very phenomenon, that the city was like a Swiss cheese, hence the illustration, that one could assume it to be a kind of continuous solid mass out of which figural spaces might be cut. Okay. The trouble is, of course, of course, there's always a problem. The trouble is, of course, what seems to be a move to field, what seems to be a move to a kind of overall quality of continuous space within the city, which now might form the site of a theory of event, suddenly becomes exactly its opposite. Because we no longer have an architecture of figural objects in which we're discussing the objectness of an object with interiority, right? With exteriority, rather, which is dominated by its exterior quality and its identity as an exterior facade wrapping a discrete object, and so on. We're talking about the object of interiority, in which the space of the city, cut as a series of public spaces, has figuration in itself as object. So if we want to escape this notion of the commodification of the object as a discrete experience, we can't do it by simply inverting it like this, because we're still left with the same problem. So what seems to be a shift into field is nothing of the kind, but is really the reiteration of modernism, but from the opposite side of the coin. All the values are the same. It simply presents itself as a different kind of stylistic take, and really that is all that it is. The values of architecture are not challenged, certainly not from the perspectives that I've pointed out. Certainly not in terms of how it might be conceptualized from the material conditions of its production. Yeah. Here I wanted to go on about a second condition of, which I will, of course, a second condition which might lead us to field, and that is a condition which I think is less easily associated with notions of field until you see what I'll share you in a second. But there is an issue that I found very instructive personally and very fruitful personally within the project of contextualism or neo-rationalism, and that was the project of producing a typology, typological studies. For a very good reason, that from the point of view of an open typology, of an expansive and inclusive typology, the collection of examples and their subsequent comparison becomes a kind of emancipatory project. In other words, one can quickly go beyond the restrictive style regimes of existing architectural preoccupations within a construct like that. I mean, one can collect thousands upon thousands of examples, rank them, map them, reorganize them, and so on and so forth. It is, of course, a radical opportunity. Typology is extensively radical in the sense that it promises to deliver up many and multiple architectures. So, of course, it comes specifically confusing for somebody like me then to say, well, given this conceptual tool, why then do we constantly refer, in Unger's case, to a series of Roman examples, principally the Villa Adriana in Rome, and in Colin Rowe's case to a discrete number of Roman architects, principally Mannerist Roman architects, and one or two modernists like Giuseppe Torani, and of course Le Corbusier. And the answer is, of course, when one constructs a radical conceptual possibility like typology, then bourgeois architecture, with a knee-jerk reaction, constructs a means by which that can be restricted, which they did tout suite. They created something called precedent. And indeed, what has come down to the architectural schools from Cornell University and from the Ticino architects in Switzerland, who were at the forefront of this amelioration of capitalist architecture. What comes down to the architectural schools is not a radical view of typology, but principally precedent. Now, I just want to say a few words about precedent. Precedent is a means by which the radical extension of typology is absolutely truncated, because it tells you that there are only things that are fit to think with. And these are principally examples which are drawn from the major cities of Europe, effectively the Baroque capitals of Europe, and a number of selected and identified architects. Now, this is, of course, utterly contradictory to a notion of typology, utterly contradictory to its emancipatory project. It's problematical. It's interesting for me, in order to think about a non-objectness or a field space, simply because it provides a mechanism by which an extended or a radical extension of vocabulary might take place. Yeah. Now the problem was, of course, how does one begin to draw the field? How does one begin to draw the very thing that architecture does not believe in? How does one come to constitute a way of analytical drawing which might examine the thing that's hardly been defined at all? In order to kind of illustrate this a little more securely, what I'll do is I'll tell you another little story. One day I was reading it was one of those Thames and Hudson glosses on the urbanism of Paris, Berlin, and London. And in this book, fortunately, there was a photograph of the Rue de Rivoli. It was a photograph by Daguerre, said it was taken, I think, in about 1857. I think it was, the Rivoli was finished then. And of course, Daguerre was using a pinhole camera, had fairly primitive instruments in order to expose a silver halide plate. I mean, in order to do this successfully, the exposure time had to be protracted, 2-3 hours at the middle of the day. So the photograph of the Rue de Rivoli, just finished by Haussmann, was one in which there was no occupying person. No moving object was present on the silver halide plate. This is very interesting because it immediately made me think of another thing that is kind of similar to this. It made me think of architectural drawings, and that architectural drawings in a way, even though they bluster about conditions of inhabitation and occupation, are like this daguerreotype, are like a kind of protracted exposure of a silver halide plate, in the sense that they have no means of capturing the occupation of space. Now this is interesting because it returns to the Vygotsky issue that I spoke about before, because in this kind of moment, in this kind of engagement with the possibilities of an architectural speculation in two-dimensional flat space of the drawing, if there is no means by which one can code the conditions of event, of occupation, then one cannot think about it. One cannot think about it. The only means by which we have of describing the possibilities of inhabitation, and therefore of producing a politics of social territorialization, is by, at the moment, is by the manipulation of lines which delimit the solid surfaces of variously disposed objects. This is not the only position. The things that set these objects into relationship, or the condition which sets these objects into relationship, are aspects of field. Social aspects in terms of event, and two-dimensional aspects in terms of the delimitation of field itself. So I audaciously asked, I think that's the phrase that a lot of people at the AA usually use in those rather glossy things they produce, audaciously asked my students to draw this kind of space, to begin to make a drawings of the space that was not described, in the daguerreotype or in architectural plans. And we began to think about what this might look like. And of course, quickly, I realized that Duchamp had started this project, and of course, Oskar Schlemmer also, but I want to quickly make a remark about this, that Raumfindung, felt space, was not the issue that we were examining. This is far too Heideggerian for somebody like me. I don't believe in felt space, Geist, spirit, or any of that shit. Absolutely not. For me, this was an examination of the possibilities of two-dimensional speculation in the flat space of the drawing. So even though it looks like Schlemmer, and though he has a kind of a suspicion of being related to the works of Schlemmer, it certainly wasn't from my point of view. Okay. Now, in order to do this kind of drawing then, I think I've got another example. Yeah, in order to do this kind of drawing, one had to, of course, since one was working outside of an object structure, completely reinvent a vocabulary on top of it. And so that conditions of field began to emerge. They didn't emerge with such in such an articulated way as I'm beginning to emerge with them now, because I wasn't looking directly at this problem, I have to say. This is still coming out of the articulation of the object. There was only a suspicion that this wasn't sufficient. These produced very over-articulate, narcissistic products. The very things that I argued against in the first part of the lecture. But nevertheless have begun to set out for me a window of opportunity which I now want to pursue in the work that I'm doing now. So, vocabularies which refer to orbits, oscillations, eurythmies, and so on, were established on the basis of these kinds of drawings, and an internal conversation was quickly established which set a completely different kind of trajectory up, which we then explored in later projects. In association with these kinds of drawings, I developed, or at least stole, really, I suppose I stole it, a kind of method. It kind of, well, it wasn't I didn't really steal it. It was a kind of misinterpretation of art and language, because I invented this thing called indexing, which I still use, which is an attempt to return to the radicality of typology by setting students huge drawing tasks within a specific amount of time. That students would be asked, for example, to produce 100 of these works in a particular time, and this can of course be done if you can persuade them to have a little discipline, that they do each drawing. Each drawing takes 10 minutes and no longer, and one doesn't expect therefore that they produce the Mona Lisa, but they would produce something which is worth 10 minutes, but it would be taken seriously, and then this collection of 100 drawings would then be set up, and from that a kind of analysis would take place, into which this typology of possibilities could then take up a kind of real structure. So this was also a kind of attempt to extend a notion of field by multiple productions, and has become now, certainly for me, a means by which I've returned quite directly to notions of typology. Now, the key issue, I suppose, and I'm nearly finished now, the key issue, for me anyway, really goes like this. Is it possible to make a social architecture, which is the first question I asked? If it is it restricted by the kind of iconographic obsessions that are currently demonstrated by the contemporary avant-garde? Is there a means of moving away from this? Is there a self-effacing architecture which releases itself from commodity fetishization? Is that architecture then occupiable by conditions of event which might be theorized by certain kinds of drawing trajectories? So what I've come to decide upon, what I've come to rest upon, if you like, is a notion of field which is a kind of overallness, a banality, if you like, out of which some kind of review of the social possibilities of architecture might be established. And of course there are existing examples, a super studio example on the left-hand side and the Archizoom example on the right-hand side are instructive, certainly to me, and of course I accept that this may be a misreading because their projects were dystopian or critical of the end game of architecture at that time, but nevertheless seem to maybe capture a moment which could be extended in the present. Certainly the superstudio identification of a fundamental particle is one very interesting move, which one might extend. Consequently, I've started a series of kind of projects which are, in a sense, attempts to try and understand this direction. Here, this is a project called Enjoyment by Force, which is for, on the left-hand side, a continuous glass roof over the city of Bologna, and on the right-hand side, the progressive roofing in of the Gleinecker Park in Berlin. I show you, this is kind of out of sequence, I'm sorry, but it's again just to reiterate the issues of typology. I was fascinated, in all forms of it, and here is a project which takes as its point of departure the drawing codes laid down by the RIBA and produces a kind of approach to it. Sorry, that was a bit out of sequence. And these are the sort of projects that I'm currently doing at the TU in Berlin, which are attempts to begin to set out a notion of field in the terms that I've already established. These are again typological possibilities which are crossed at this time with different kinds of programs. Here the stripes set out different kinds of programs and are set out in different kinds of field densities. Currently, I am trying to establish a kind of continuing typological investigation of the possibilities of field by setting up a series of terms on two grids and seeing if I can reduce the differences between these moves to an absolute minimum and then extend this kind of this typology as far as possible, in a hope that I can begin to establish the sort of operating terms of an overall space, of a kind of space that might now be returned to social issues. This is a project which attempts to begin to do this. Not very well. It's an early project for the reinvigoration of a site that is currently kind of fallow below Herzog de Meuron's redevelopment of the Bankside Power Station. It promises to be a site which might follow a number of other districts in the city to a certain kind of reinvigoration as a consequence of the introduction of a major cultural building. The problem we looked at was how do we begin this process, not from the point of view of establishing a series of objects, but by engaging one of these poles of issues of field. And the one we engaged was the issue of event. We tried to set up a series of events which could leave some kind of trace behind in order to focus attention of the city on this site, which would then bring, we hoped, some moves to an initial reinvigoration of the area. And these are some of the drawings that I'm struggling to do. This is the fairly old, actually, which might set out a graphical engagement with issues of field. At the moment, I'm trying to establish a series of densities and patterns based on the typology that I'm working with, by using only two values in the space, in the field space of the city, and working only with certain kinds of grid structures, and to see what kind of possible spatialities might be subtended by the absence and presence of these elements. Very, very basic and banal stuff. And that's it. Thank you very much.